"Read it to him slowly," the man in the velvet jacket said, loud enough for the whole gallery to hear. "He may need a moment. The big ones usually do." He meant the man beside me. He meant Sergeant Cadman Rowe of the Queen's Household Guard, who stood at the doorway of the long gallery in his red wool tunic and tall bearskin, white gloves folded over the muzzle of his rifle, eyes level on the middle distance, as motionless as the marble busts ranged along the wall behind him. I am Corporal Tobias Lynn. I stood the post beside Rowe that night, 2 paces to his left, and I will tell you exactly what happened, because I was close enough to watch a roomful of clever people make the single most expensive mistake of their evening, and not one of them knew it until it was far too late. It was the Laurel Evening at Ressingham House, a fictional name for a real enough kind of place, the annual gathering where the house handed its literary medal to some poet or essayist, and the whole gilded learned world came to drink and circle and judge one another. The poets came. The critics came. The professors came in their soft jackets with their soft hands, and they came mostly, I had always thought, to be seen agreeing with whoever was winning. We stood the doors. We are furniture to those people on an ordinary night. Beautiful furniture, polished, expensive, but furniture. You learn not to mind. You learn to let your eyes go past them to the far wall and let the talk wash over you like weather. But this man would not let us be weather. His name, I would learn, was Professor Hallam Vane, a critic of some standing, a man who had built a long career on being the cleverest voice in any room and on making sure everyone knew it. He had a face that had spent 40 years arranging itself into amusement at other people's expense. He had stopped in front of Rowe with 2 younger academics trailing him like ducklings, a glass in his hand, and he had decided, for sport, to make the guardsmen the evening's entertainment. "Look at him," Vane said to his companions, tilting his glass toward Rowe. "The household's finest, all that wool and brass to hold a door open. Do you suppose there's anything behind the eyes, or is it all drill? Left foot, right foot, salute the gentleman." The younger 2 laughed the careful laugh of people who laugh at whatever the senior man finds funny. Rowe did not move, not a flicker. I knew the cost of that stillness because I was paying it too, the slow burn that starts in the jaw and travels down, the thing you swallow because the post is the post, and the uniform is older than your temper. We do not answer. That is the whole discipline of the thing. You stand for something larger than the sting of one rude man, and you do not let him make you small by making you loud. "I'll wager," Vane went on, warming to his audience, for a small crowd had begun to gather at the edges, drawn the way crowds always are to the smell of someone being cut down. "I'll wager our friend here has never read a book in his life. Why would he? You don't recite Wordsworth to a rifle. He's muscle. Magnificent muscle, granted, but the lights are on and nobody's reading." More laughter, louder now. Someone filmed it on a phone. I saw the little screen glow. Then Vane did the thing that he thought was the masterstroke, and that was in fact the rope he hung himself with. He turned to the wall behind us, where, beneath glass in a slim gilt frame, the house displayed a single famous stanza, the lines that the Laurel Medal had been founded to honor, the most quoted lines in the country, the ones every schoolchild learned and every politician misquoted at funerals. You have heard lines like them. The whole gallery had been built, in a sense, around that frame. "Here," Vane said, and he read them aloud in his rolling lecture hall voice, savoring each word, performing them for the crowd. He read the famous lines about the watch kept in the dark, and the lamp that is carried not for the one who carries it, but for the ones who will never know his name. He read them beautifully, I'll grant him that. And then he turned back to Rowe with a smile like a man, laying down a winning card. "Do you even know what that means, soldier? Do you know who wrote those words? Or are they just noise to you, pretty noise the clever people make while you hold the door?" He leaned in, close enough that I could have counted the threads in his collar. "Go on, tell the room, who wrote it?" And Cadman Rowe, who had not moved, who had not so much as blinked through all of it, did something then that he was not supposed to do. and that I had never once seen him do on a post in 3 years of standing beside the man. He looked at Vane. Just for a moment, eyes off the middle distance down and level into the professor's face. It was the smallest thing. To the crowd it probably looked like nothing. But I had stood next to that man through a state funeral and a bomb scare and a night of black ice on the forecourt, and I had never seen him give his eyes to a provoker, not once. The discipline that kept them forward was bone deep, and he had just spent it deliberately on Hallam Vane. The professor took it as a triumph. Ah, so there is someone home. He spread his hands to the crowd. Watch, the statue stirs, perhaps it will grunt. Rowe's eyes went back to the middle distance. He said nothing, and I felt the whole thing tip, not toward the explosion the crowd was waiting for, but toward something quieter and far heavier, the way the air changes before the first real roll of thunder. Because I had caught what no one else in that gallery had caught. When Vane read those famous lines, when he rolled them out in his lecture voice and performed them for the room, I had been watching Rowe's gloved hands on the rifle. And on the second line, the one about the lamp carried for the ones who will never know his name, his thumb had moved. The smallest pressure against the white glove. The way a man's hand moves when he hears something that belongs to him. I didn't understand it yet. I only knew, standing 2 paces to his left, that the professor in the velvet jacket had just read a roomful of strangers a poem, and that the one man he was mocking knew it better than anyone alive, and that whatever was coming was going to land on the wrong people entirely. A woman came through the crowd then. Silver-haired, severe, a house steward's ribbon at her throat, the kind of woman who runs an evening like this from behind the scenes and is never thanked for it. Her name was Mrs. Asher, the gallery's archivist, and she had been at Ressingham House longer than the medal itself. She had heard the last of it. She stopped at the edge of the little circle Vane had drawn around himself, and she looked at the professor, and then she looked for a long, strange moment at Sergeant Rowe. Something passed over her face, recognition, the slow, disbelieving dawn of it. "Professor Vane," she said quietly, "a word, before you say anything else to that man." Vane waved her off without turning. "In a moment, my dear. I'm conducting a small experiment in the limits of the military mind." The ducklings tittered. "No," Mrs. Asher said, and her voice did not rise, but it cut clean through the gallery the way the truly certain voice always does. "Now, because you are about to embarrass yourself in front of every person in this room, and I would rather you didn't do it under our roof." The laughter died. The whole gallery turned, and I watched Hallam Vane's smile begin, very slightly, to falter. He recovered fast, the way men of his sort always do. He took a sip of his wine, made a small show of patience, and turned to face the archivist as though she were a slightly tiresome interruption in a lecture he was enjoying. "Mrs. Asher," he said, "always a pleasure. But I assure you the guardsman is not embarrassed. He can't be. That's rather the point of him." He gestured at Rowe with the glass. "He has the great gift of never having to wonder whether he understands anything. Wouldn't you say it's a kind of peace?" A few of the braver hangers-on laughed again, uncertainly. But the temperature of the room had changed, and they could feel it changing, and a laugh that has to be forced past doubt is a thin and ugly sound. Mrs. Asher did not laugh. She came forward 2 steps until she stood beside the gilt frame on the wall, the famous stanza glinting behind glass at her shoulder. She is not a tall woman. She did not need to be. "You read those lines very well, Professor," she said. "You always do. I have heard you read them at 3 of these evenings now, and each time you read them as though you wrote them yourself." She let that sit a moment. "Tell me, in all the years you have built your reputation on those 8 lines, the most beloved lines in the language, you have called them in print more than once. Have you ever once met the man who actually did write them?" Vane's mouth opened, and for the first time that night nothing clever came out of it. He glanced at the frame. The poem in the frame is published, as everyone in that room knew, under a single name, a pen name, a plain old soldier's name that had appeared on a slim, anonymous collection some years before and had never once attached itself to a face. The poet had never given an interview, had never accepted a prize in person, had never, as far as the literary world knew, been seen at all. He was a rumor wrapped in 8 lines. Half the room had spent half their careers arguing about who he might be: a dying officer, a cloistered monk, a hoax, a committee. "No one has met him," Vane said, and there was the faintest crack in the smooth surface of his voice. "He doesn't exist as he's a recluse, a pseudonym, possibly several people. You know perfectly well the manuscript came to the publisher without a return address." He found his footing again, and his smile came back, sharper now, because nothing makes a frightened clever man crueler than the suspicion he might be wrong. "What on earth has that to do with the door holder?" Mrs. Asher looked at Sergeant Rowe. And Sergeant Rowe, who had said nothing, who had given his eyes to the professor exactly once and then taken them back, stood at his post in the perfect stillness of a man who has decided that the cheapest thing he can do is the right one. To let it go, to let the rude man have his evening, to be furniture for 1 more hour, and then go home. I want you to understand what that stillness was. It was not the stillness of a man with nothing to say. I knew that now. It was the stillness of a man who could have ended the whole thing with a single sentence and had decided, out of something far rarer than pride, not to. He would have let Hallam Vane mock him to the bottom of his glass and never once corrected the record. That was the discipline. That was the thing that no professor in a velvet jacket would ever understand about the man in front of him, that the guard's silence was not emptiness. It was a choice, made over and over, to carry a thing and not need anyone to know he carried it. It was the lamp in the poem, carried for the ones who will never know his name. I think Mrs. Asher understood that too, and I think it was the only reason she hesitated. She knew something the room did not. You could see her weighing it, the man's privacy against the public cruelty he was about to be buried under, the cost of speaking against the cost of letting a fool win. And I think, in the end, she decided that some kinds of silence protect a man, and some kinds only protect the people who are wronging him, and that this one had crossed over from the first into the second. "Sergeant," she said gently, not an order, a question almost, "may I?" And Cadman Rowe, and I felt my own breath stop when he did it, gave the smallest nod. A centimeter, permission. Mrs. Asher turned back to the gallery, and to the professor, and she said, in the plain, flat voice of a woman simply stating a fact she has held for a long time, "The lines in that frame, Professor Vane, the 8 lines you have just performed for us, about the watch in the dark, and the lamp carried for the ones who will never know, were written by the man you have spent the last 10 minutes calling Muscle." She did not raise her voice. "Sergeant Cadman Rowe wrote them. He is the poet you have built your reputation explaining. The recluse, you say, does not exist, has been standing at your door all evening, holding it open for you, while you read his own words back to him to prove he is too stupid to understand them. I have stood in a great many quiet rooms. I have stood the silence of a cathedral, and the silence of a death watch, and the silence of a forecourt at 3 in the morning. I had never heard a silence like the one that fell over the long gallery of Ressingham House in that moment. It was the silence of 40 clever people all arriving, at the exact same instant, at the understanding that they had been laughing at the wrong man. Hallam Vane laughed. It came out of him as a reflex, the panic laugh of a man whose entire identity has just been kicked out from under him and who has not yet hit the ground. That's absurd," he said. "That's a charming story, Mrs. Asher, but you can't possibly. The manuscript was anonymous. There's no, where is your proof?" He turned to Rowe, and now there was something almost pleading under the contempt, because if it was true, it was the end of him, and some animal part of him already knew it. "Say something. Tell her she's wrong. You can't even say something, man." Rowe looked at him a second time. And this time he spoke. "You've changed a word," Rowe said. His voice was low and even and carried no farther than it needed to. It was the first full sentence any of those people had heard from him, and it landed in the dead silence of that gallery like a stone dropped into a still pond. Vane blinked. "I beg your pardon." The fourth line. Ro's eyes had gone back to the middle distance, the discipline reasserting itself even now, even here. "You read it as the lamp he carries through the cold. It isn't through, it's against. The lamp he carries against the cold. I know," he said, "because I wrote it that way on purpose, and because every man who has read it aloud to flatter himself in front of a room has changed it back to through, because through is easier to say, and they're none of them really listening to the words. They're listening to themselves saying the words. You did it just now. You've done it every year." A pause. "I've heard you do it from this door." You could have heard a glove drop. Vane's mouth worked. He looked at the frame. He looked at the frame the way a man looks at a step he has just realized isn't there, because he could check it. Everyone in that room could check it. The lines were 6 feet away under glass, in the poet's own approved text, and the fourth word of the fourth line was, plain as morning against. Anyone could know that, Vane managed, but the strength had gone out of it. Anyone who'd memorized the "it proves nothing." Mrs. Asher reached up and lifted the gilt frame off its hook. She did it carefully, with both hands, the way she would have handled anything in her care, and she carried it the few steps to where Rose stood and turned it so the back faced the room. There was an envelope fixed to the backing board with old conservation tape, yellowed at the edges, and a card behind a second pane of glass. "When the house founded the metal," she said to the gallery, "it wrote through its solicitors to the publisher and through the publisher to the anonymous poet and asked one thing of him, that he leave for the house's record some token by which a future archivist might confirm the authorship if it ever needed confirming. A man who wishes to stay unknown does not give you his name, so he gave us this." She turned the card to the light. A line, in his own hand. The 9th line, the one he cut from the final poem, the line no one has ever read, that exists nowhere in print, that he kept back precisely so that on a day like this one, no impostor could ever claim his work. She held it up. "I have kept this card for 19 years. I have shown it to no one. There is exactly one living person who could tell you without looking what it says." She lowered the card and looked at Sergeant Rowe. So did 40 people. So did the phone, still glowing at the edge of the crowd, recording every second of it now. Rowe did not look at the card. He looked straight ahead at the far wall, at nothing, in the posture he had held all night, and he recited quietly 8 measured words. Mrs. Asher turned the card over and read it to the room. The words matched. Of course they matched. And the sound the gallery made then was not a gasp and not applause. It was a kind of low collective exhalation, the sound of a great many people setting down, all at once, a thing they had been carrying wrong. I am not going to pretend I understood in that moment how a sergeant of the household guard came to be the most famous unseen poet in the country. I learned the shape of it later, in pieces, the way you learn anything true about a man like Rowe, never from him directly, always from the edges. He had not always stood doors. Before the bearskin he had carried a different weight entirely. He had served 11 years in a line regiment, in places whose names don't go on the brass, and he had come home the way a certain kind of man comes home, with the names of the ones who didn't come home stacked up somewhere inside him where they would not stop being heavy. He did not drink them down. He did not talk them out. He had no gift for that and no taste for it. What he had, it turned out, was a small hard talent for putting the unbearable into 8 lines and folding it up so tight that it could be carried. He wrote, at first, the way some men pray, privately badly, then less badly, and then one night in a barracks half a country away, he wrote a thing about a watch kept in the dark, and a lamp carried against the cold for the ones who would never know the name of the man who carried it. And he understood that he had finally said the thing he had been unable to say at 11 funerals. He did not want a career out of it. He wanted, I think, the opposite of a career. He sent the pages to a publisher with no return address because he wanted the words to do their work without him standing in front of them taking bows. Because the whole point of the lamp in the poem is that the man who carries it is not the point. And then he did the most consistent thing a man of his nature could possibly do. He took the quietest, most anonymous, most patient post he could find, a door, a wall, a uniform older than fame, and he stood it, year after year, while the country he wrote for argued about who he might be, and read his lines at funerals and built medals around his stanza, and walked past the man himself 1,000 times a day without once seeing him. He had stood this very door, this very gallery, for 3 laurel evenings. He had stood at the threshold while they handed his medal to other people. He had listened to professors perform his grief for applause, and he had never said a word, because saying a word was not what the lamp was for. Until a man in a velvet jacket leaned in and asked him, in front of everyone, whether he could even read. "I'm sorry," I heard Rose say then, very low, almost to himself, and it took me a moment to understand he was not apologizing to Vane. He was apologizing to Mrs. Asher, to the room, to the quiet he had kept and just been forced to break. I never meant for it to come up. That, more than anything, was when I understood what kind of man I had been standing beside for 3 years and never known it. Hallam Vane had gone the color of the wall behind him. I watched the realization move through him in stages, and it was not a pleasant thing to watch, even though no man in that room had earned it more. First the disbelief, scrabbling for a foothold. Then the memory, and I could see him replaying it, every word he had said in the last 10 minutes, the muscle, the lights on and nobody reading, the "do you even know what it means" soldier, each one landing on him now with the full weight it had been built to carry. And then last, the worst of it, the understanding that he had not just been wrong in private. He had been wrong loudly, at length, on purpose, in front of every person whose good opinion his whole life was made of, and it was being filmed. "I didn't," he started. He stopped. He tried again. "How was I to know? He's wearing," he gestured helplessly at the tunic, the bearskin, the rifle, as though the uniform itself had conspired to deceive him. And there it was. The whole of his error, confessed without his meaning to confess it. He had looked at the uniform and decided he knew the man. He had seen the wool and the brass and the silent stillness, and filled in the rest from his own contempt, illiterate, simple, furniture, muscle, and never once entertained the possibility that the most disciplined silence in the room belonged to the deepest mind in it. He had mistaken restraint for emptiness. It is the oldest mistake the clever make about the quiet, and it is almost always the clever who pay for it. A younger woman stepped forward from the crowd, one of the evening's actual honorees, I learned afterward, a poet of real gift who had won a smaller prize that night. She was pale and furious. "You read his lamp line wrong on purpose for years," she said to Vane, and her voice shook. "You corrected me on it in a review. You told me I'd misremembered the word. I changed it. I changed his line because you told me to." She turned and looked at Roe, and her fury collapsed into something nearer grief. "I'm so sorry. I've quoted you my whole life, and I let him tell me I had it wrong." "You had it right," Roe said quietly. "Most readers do. It's only the ones who perform it that get it wrong." He was not being cruel. There was no triumph in him at all, which was somehow the thing that finished Vane more completely than any triumph could have. The professor had come spoiling for a contest of wits, and had walked into a man who simply did not want one, who would have given anything not to have this happen, and whose every word now was lighter and kinder than Vane had any right to. You cannot win a duel against a man who refuses to draw. You can only stand there with your blade out, looking like exactly what you are. "I think," Mrs. Asher said, and she rehung the frame on its hook with the same unhurried care she had taken it down, "that the experiment in the limits of the military mind is concluded. The limits, Professor, appear to have been elsewhere." The crowd did not laugh. That is the part I remember most clearly. There was no jeering, no turning of the mob, none of the ugly pleasure a crowd usually takes in watching the mighty fall. The room was too stunned, and too ashamed of its own laughter from 5 minutes before, to enjoy anything. What it felt like instead was a great correction. A room full of people who had spent their lives sorting the world into those worth listening to and those worth holding doors, quietly turning that sorting over in their hands and finding it broken. Vane set his glass down on the nearest surface. His hand was not steady. He looked at Roe one more time, and for just a moment the velvet jacket and the 40 years of being the cleverest voice fell away, and what was left was a frightened, diminished man who had built his entire house on the conviction that understanding was a thing that belonged to people like himself and not to people like the man at the door, and who had just watched that house come down. "I have written," he said, and his voice was barely there. "I have written 11,000 words about those lines. Essays. A chapter I built, he could not finish it." "I know," Rose said. And then, because he was the man he was, he gave Hallam Vane the one thing the professor had never once offered him, and the only thing that could possibly have been worse than scorn. He gave him mercy. "They're good essays," Rose said. "The one about the watch and the dark, you understood that one. You just never thought to wonder who'd kept the watch." He paused. "It isn't a sin to read a man's words for years and not know his face. That was the point of writing them that way. The sin was deciding because of a coat that there couldn't be a face worth knowing." I have turned that sentence over a great many times since that night. It was, I think, the truest thing said in that gallery, and it was said by the man who had the most cause to say something cruel and chose the hardest thing instead. Vane did not answer. There was nothing to answer. He gathered the shreds of himself, gave Mrs. Asher a small broken bow that she did not return, and walked out of the long gallery through the very door that Sergeant Rowe was holding open for him, because that was Rowe's post, and the post does not change for a man's bad evening. And so the poet held the door for the critic on his way out into the worst night of his career, white glove on the gilded handle, eyes forward, perfectly correct. The professor stopped on the threshold. He looked at the white glove. I think he understood then exactly what was being shown him, that the man would hold the door for him with the same steady courtesy he showed the medal winners and the dignitaries, that nothing in Rowe's discipline would bend even an inch to take a deserved revenge, and that this unbought evenness, was the discipline Vane had spent 10 minutes calling emptiness. He went out. The door closed, and the long gallery of Ressingham House stood for a moment in the strangest silence I have ever kept. 40 clever people and 2 guardsmen and a silver-haired archivist, all of us holding the same understanding, none of us quite knowing what to do with it. Then Mrs. Asher turned to Sergeant Rowe, and she did a thing that I will carry to the end of my own service. She did not thank him. She did not praise him. She simply inclined her head, a short, formal, complete bow, the bow you give to rank, the bow the house gives its honored, and she held it a moment longer than courtesy required. And the room, seeing it, did the same, not as a mob, one by one. The young poet first, then the honorees, then the professors in their soft jackets who had laughed, then the rest, until every head in the long gallery was bowed to the man at the door, not to the poet, I think, though they thought it was to the poet, to the silence, to the years of it, to the lamp carried against the cold for the ones who would never know the name of the man who carried it. Rowe stood it the way he stood everything, eyes forward, perfectly still. He did not bow back. A guard does not bow at his post. But I was 2 paces to his left, close enough to see it, and I will tell you what I saw. His thumb moved against the white glove, once. The evening went on because evenings do. The medal was given. The speeches were made, and they were different speeches than they would have been an hour before, quieter, more careful, with fewer certainties in them. I noticed the speakers stopped performing. A few of them, when they quoted the famous lines, glanced toward the door before they said them, and they got the 4th word right, every one against the cold, and I do not think a single one of them did it by accident. Word travels in a room like that the way fire travels in dry grass. By the end of the night, there was not a person at Ressingham House who did not know that the recluse had been found, and that he had been holding their coats and their doors for 3 years, and that they had walked past him 1,000 times. What I expected to happen next did not happen. I expected the press. I expected the cameras at the gate the following morning, the appeals for an interview. The man's quiet life cracked open like an egg. The phone had filmed all of it. By midnight the clip was everywhere, and by the next afternoon the whole country knew the shape of the story: the professor who mocked the guard who turned out to be the poet, the line read wrong for 19 years. It was, for about a week, the only thing anyone talked about. But here is the thing they could not get. No matter how many cameras they brought to the gate, they could not get Roe. He gave no interviews. He accepted no prizes. The house, to its great credit, closed around him like a fist. Mrs. Asher saw to that, and refused every request, and the publisher, who had kept his secret for 19 years, kept it for the rest of them too. There was a great deal of noise about the man who would not come out and take his due, and a number of clever people wrote a number of clever pieces about why he wouldn't, and not one of them got it right, because the answer was too simple for clever people to credit. He would not come out and take his due because the poem had never been about him. It had been about the watch and the dark and the lamp and the ones who would never know. To stand up and take a bow for it would have been to unwrite it. He understood that the way he understood breathing. So he did the only thing that kept the lines true. He went back to his post. He stood the next morning's duty at the east door as though nothing had happened. Same wool, same brass, same forward eyes. I stood beside him. Neither of us mentioned the night before for a long time. That is how it is done in our line. You carry the thing, you do not narrate it. But I asked him once, weeks later, when we were off the post and the rest of the section had gone ahead, and it was just the two of us walking back across the yard in the cold. I asked him why he had let Mrs. Asher say it. Why, after 3 years and 19 years and 11 funerals, after a whole life built on not being found, he had given that 1 centimeter of a nod and let it all come down. He was quiet for a while. We could see our breath. Because of the line, he said finally. Which line? Mine, the lamp carried against the cold for the ones who will never know his name. He looked straight ahead the way he always did. Vane read it as a thing the carrier suffers. The lonely man in the dark, unthanked. People always read it that way. They think it's sad. He shook his head once. It isn't sad. It was never sad. The whole point is that not being known is the freedom that lets you carry the lamp at all. The moment you carry it to be seen carrying it, the light goes out. That's the line. A pause. But there's a difference between not being known and being lied about. I could stand a man not knowing my name. I have stood that gladly for 19 years. It's the best thing that ever happened to the words. What I could not stand, what would have put the light out, was standing there while he taught a whole room that the man who keeps the watch is too simple to know what he's keeping. That's not anonymity. That's a lie about the kind of man who carries lamps. And I have known too many of them, and buried too many of them, to let it stand for the price of 1 centimeter of my pride. I have never forgotten that. The man would surrender his secret, his peace, his hard-won invisibility, every single thing he had spent 2 decades protecting, but he would not surrender the truth about the men he had written the poem for. The dead ones, the unthanked ones, the ones whose names don't go on the brass. He broke his silence not to save himself but to keep faith with them, and the instant the faith was kept he went straight back to the silence, because the silence was where the faith lived. That is the whole of the man, if you want it in one breath. He let the room learn his name to defend the ones who would never have one. As for Hallam Vane, I will tell you because people always ask. He did not come to Ressingham House again. The clip did him real harm. The clever world he had ruled is not kind to a fallen king, and it had watched him kick a quiet man and learned in the same minute that the quiet man was the best of them. His essays got read differently after that. The chapter on the watch in the dark got read with a new and unflattering attention to the question of who, exactly, the author of it had imagined himself qualified to explain. But I heard a year on that he had written one more piece short, and unlike anything he had published in 40 years. It was not clever. It made no argument. It was 3 pages on the difference between reading a man's words and knowing his face, and on the foolishness of a life spent believing the two were the same. And it ended, Mrs. Asher told me, with the 4th line of the poem quoted correctly, against the cold, and a single sentence after it. I had it wrong for 19 years, and a man in a red coat was kind enough to tell me so, and kinder still not to enjoy it. I never knew his name, and now I do, and the knowing has not improved the poem, but it has, I hope, improved the reader. Ro read it. I watched him read it off duty at the long table in the guardroom, his face giving away nothing at all. When he finished, he folded the paper in half and then in half again, the way you fold a thing you mean to keep, and he put it in his breast pocket over the brass, and he said only, "He got the word right." And that, from Sergeant Cadman Rowe, was the highest praise he had in him to give. He stands the east door still. You have walked past him probably if you have ever been to that part of the country, a tall guardsman in a red tunic and a bearskin white gloves on the rifle, eyes level on the middle distance, as still and silent as the marble. You would not look at him twice. You would think, as Vane thought, that there is nothing behind the eyes but drill. You would be wrong, the way the clever are always wrong about the quiet. Behind that unmoving face is the man who wrote the line your country says at its funerals. He is keeping the watch. He is carrying the lamp. And he does not need you to know his name, but he would like you very much to get the word right. It's against the cold, not through it. He carried it against the cold for the ones who will never know. He always has. He always will. And the door he holds open is steadier for the weight of it than any of us will ever understand.